Welcome to the Music Mission. My name is Panayoti Karamanos. I am a music teacher in Sydney, Australia, as well as the conductor and director of the Modest Orchestra, an orchestra consisting of passionate professional musicians that prioritise the education and enjoyment of music through the performance of staple works and new compositions. All recordings you hear, including this background music, come from our public performances, which you can find on YouTube if you search Modest Orchestra. This podcast is designed for all lovers of music, no matter your musical preference, experience, or expertise. Now on to today's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. On today's episode, we're going to be exploring the Suzuki Method with my guest Cardinia Steens, who I've known for quite a few years now. Went to high school together. And Cardi, this is our third attempt at doing this podcast. Because technology often has problems. Would you like to say hi?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Cardinia. I've known Penny for some time now, obviously through school. And since finishing school, I've continued my violin teaching, performing, also completed a law degree, and now happen to run a not-for-profit music organisation in my local community.
That's fantastic. So, Carter, we've spoken a bit about this this music center, but could you explain it to our listeners what this music center is? How, what do they teach? Any background information about it?
Absolutely. So we've been a not-for-profit organisation for 25 years, and have been giving access essentially to the community to high-quality tuition. In sort of a local space. And one of the things that we do differently is that we are a very culturally diverse centre. And so we've got teachers of all different backgrounds teaching instruments, both Suzuki qualified teachers and also traditional teachers. And the difference being there that to be a Suzuki qualified teacher, that you would have to undergo training with the Suzuki Association. And a traditional teacher just being someone that's simply not a Suzuki qualified teacher, but that obviously has their music teaching qualifications.
Yeah, wow. So the Suzuki Method, I'm off level 1 trained, and I'm about to do my Kadai, and I'm assuming that Suzuki has a similar sort of training system and level system. Could you explain perhaps just briefly the process that you have to go through that? I know for ORF it's a 1 week intensive, like 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. full on week, and Kadai is 2 weeks. Just quickly explain it, and then I guess for listeners who don't know what Suzuki is, just a brief overview of its teaching pedagogy.
Yeah, look, so I'm not a Suzuki qualified teacher myself, so I don't know the exact intricacies, but from my understanding, the Suzuki training is something that takes years. So it's not something that you could complete in the matter of a year or so. But
Wow.
what it requires is involvement for the teacher to undergo professional development training. And that starts out by sending off a recording of your playing ability, and then the Suzuki Association inviting you, if you're at that suitable level, to then attend their professional development training and courses, which really just sheds light on what the Suzuki philosophy is, what the teaching methodology is.
Wow.
And you would do that, for example, over a period of a couple of months. And then you would also submit an essay about what the method is about, to ensure that obviously you're in line with their philosophy. And then over the course of years, you would actually progress through their diplomas. And so what that means is that you then as a teacher become qualified to teach certain books in the Suzuki method. So for example, don't quote me on this, but if you have got your sort of level 1 diploma through Suzuki, you're then able to teach, for example, book 1 to maybe book 3. And then, in the following few years, if you then get the next diploma, then you're qualified to teach books 4 to 6, and so on. So it is very
Right.
much something that takes a period of time. Just saying that you're even a Suzuki qualified teacher isn't something that happens overnight. It can really take up to 10 years. And so you will need to, if you wanted to go through the whole Suzuki method and their whole, all of their books, you would have to be partnered with a teacher that is actually qualified to take you through all those books. And so that training very much goes towards teaching how you should teach, or how you could teach each of those pieces.
Yeah, wow. So unlike Orphan Kandai, I suppose, where they're almost, I don't want to say it, but compared to Suzuki, they seem almost a fast-tracked version of a pedagogy that you can approach a quicker way. This seems to be a lifelong journey that you're always trying to achieve. Um, so could you explain what the Suzuki method is? A lot of wind and brass players have heard of the fabled Suzuki method, and they always think, oh, it's a car. So, what's it about? When did it really start? And is it something that's, yeah, just explain what it is.
So, from my understanding, I think the Suzuki methodology really came out from obviously Dr. Suzuki, who was a violinist and really wanted to open up the world of music to young children. And so he followed the way that young children learn, for example, a language, in that they learn how to speak before they read. And so that's through, for example, listening and through immersion. And so if you apply that same approach to learning music, which is developing your oral skills before learning how to read the music, that is very much a natural progression as to how you would learn a language. And music being a language in and of itself, that's
Right.
what children can do. And so the Suzuki method really allows young students, generally speaking, for example, from 3.5 and above, to develop those oral skills and then be able to progress in the natural, in a very natural way, prior to learning those sight reading skills, which is something that you would naturally be more familiar with as a young person who's familiar with the alphabet and knows their numbers. So, in saying that, for parents wanting to introduce their child to learn music through the Suzuki method, what it is it's very much sort of it's actually a methodology not just for music, but how to develop your child as a whole. And so it
Right.
requires a lot of nurturing and involvement of the parent. So it's not as simple as dropping your child off at a lesson. It actually requires you to be on this journey with the child and the teacher. So it's very much sort of a triangular shape. And the reason for that is because, at the age of 3.5, and above, to 5, a child doesn't always have the skills to remember what's happened in the lesson and
No,
to
they don't.
carry that material home. And so that responsibility really is with the parent to understand how and what they are learning in the lesson so they can mirror that at home.
Right. Does the parent have to be musically trained or just musically inclined, or they just, they learning at the same time and at the same rate as the student in most
Absolutely not. So
cases?
they don't need to have musical experience, but you need to have a willingness to learn and to support your child. And so that's one of the great things, because it means that anyone can be introduced to music, but it's about your willingness to learn. And so the teacher will take you through in a very sort of calm and structured manner as to how you can teach your child music and how you can learn about music as well. And so one of the first places you would start is obviously to listen to the Suzuki CD as you're going to sleep in the car. You'll know the Suzuki repertoire, off by heart. Because you're just so familiar with listening to those sounds, in the same way that when you listen to a piece that you like on repeat, you sort of naturally start humming to it because you know the tune. And so you do that as a young child, but with the Suzuki repertoire, you can then have an idea when you're playing or learning the piece what it should sound like. And so your ears are sort of more tuned to, oh, does that sound a little bit high, a little bit lower, so a little bit sharp, or a little bit flat. And you can then sort of pitch the notes as you go. But in saying that, it's not that you don't learn how to read. I think that's sometimes a misconception that, you're not learning how to sight read. It's not, that's
Right.
not the case at all. It's just delayed until you're at an age, or, a sort of maturity where you are yourself familiar
Right.
with knowing how to identify general symbols, familiar with the alphabet, and familiar with your numbers, um, to then have that to be a focus. But there, like I
Yeah.
said, with the Suzuki method, there's very much an emphasis on, it's very much about just, I think, general principles about, how to develop discipline in the child, so having practice become a habit, how to actually demonstrate respect towards the teacher in a one-on-one environment, and so how to maintain that communication. So there's lots of different elements that you're learning and you're training your child to learn at that young age, as opposed to it being just additional tuition. That's absolutely not the case, and that's at least what is not emphasized. And so they
Right.
really do that by, through the association being actually a worldwide association, also a global association, in that, they have workshops, national workshops for the children to be involved in, which allows them to play with other students. So it's very collaborative experience, um, and to actually learn from, professional tutors throughout the world.
Right. So I really love how it's kind of got this child developmental phase in mind. Children learn how to vocalize first, and then they learn how to imitate sounds. That's how we learn language. Saying baba, dada, mama, papa, all those things. So it's very interesting how they learn to actually hear the music and recreate it. So I guess that's why quite often, violinists, and pianists, they have perfect pitch because they've had the early exposure to music. And so they've been able to, the synapses in the brain, the connections, the neural links, they're much higher when you're young. That's why you can take on more information. That's why you can learn languages when you're so young. Um, that would explain actually why a lot of violinists and pianists tend to have perfect pitch, whereas wind players, they don't tend to, because at around the age of 10, 11, when you start learning a brass wind instrument, the connections, they're still crazy up there, but they're starting to, the branches are starting to cut down. So it's quite fascinating. My question is there ever a time when you should move on from the Suzuki, and what age is that? Is there a limitation to the philosophy, or is it something that carries through your whole life?
So, first of all, I think it absolutely is something that just carries through the whole life, because where I think there is confusion is that the Suzuki method isn't something that you sort of opt in and opt out of. It's actually just a
Right.
teaching philosophy. So you could have, for example, Suzuki qualified teachers that teach you through using the Suzuki books, or using external materials as well. And so that could be, for example, materials from the AMEB syllabus. But what people sometimes are confused by is it's just an approach to teaching. And so naturally, as you get older and you develop more skills, the way that you learn will change over time. And so as long as what you need to do is just be tuned in to your teacher, to see whether and how their teaching style is complementing your learning. And so one of the great things about Suzuki is that it can take you all the way from book one all the way to book 10 as a professional, but it's about teaching you in a way that uses the repertoire in the books. There's no, yeah, I think in short, there's no opting in and opting out in the same way that, if you were to learn as a traditional student, and going through, in Australia, the AMEB syllabus, it's not so much that you opt in and opt out. You just use the repertoire in those books as a basis for your learning. It's sort of like, when you think about it, it's like teaching materials that you're learning. Whereas in with teachers that are teaching using the AMEB syllabus, there isn't a formal professional development course that takes the teachers necessarily through how to teach particular pieces. From
No, they
from
don't.
what
It's
I
just kind
know,
of you as a musician.
that's correct. From that, that's what I'm familiar with too. Obviously, they've got teaching diplomas available, but in
Of
terms
course,
of
yeah.
teaching the actual repertoire per se, that doesn't exist, from what I know. But whereas the Suzuki method does continue that development as a teacher, and it's more about collaborating as a community to say, well, how can we improve and share different teaching methodologies. So you might find there are a lot of teachers that are both Suzuki qualified teachers and also teach, using the AMEB repertoire and syllabus. And it really just comes down to also the goals of the parent and the child, and maybe it could be even a preference towards particular styles of music. But really, like I said, the Suzuki philosophy, it's a teaching method.
Right. Yeah. So that's actually really fascinating and really amazing because as a trumpet player, been very. I've just heard of it and I've just said, oh, this person's Suzuki trained and yada yada yada. What I'm quite fascinated about is because I specialize in high school and upper primary. Younger early developmental phases is quite interesting to me. So one of those things being at the age of 3 or 4, you have to teach them how to clap in time because kids can barely do that. They can barely, you know, keep a beat. So there's these gross motor skills that they're learning how to do. They're learning how to pick up things and explore the world, but they also have got to pick up a violin or press the right key on a piano and you put a cello between their legs. So how do you approach that? Because that's quite a intricate thing. I've tried to play violin a couple of times and I've failed. Um, so, like, how do you get the violin into their hands, so to speak?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. So I might just start with children from, toddlers from 0 to 5. So, first of all, one of the options available to them is to be involved in a Suzuki early childhood class. And that is a
Hmm.
group class that introduces just sound and play, and different instruments to the children. And so that's a great way for a young child that doesn't yet have sort of the focus and concentration to sit in a 30-minute lesson. And they would get more benefit from being in a small group class. And that's a really nice introduction to developing general motor skills, general concentration, an introduction into rhythm and sound. And what you'll find is sometimes following on from that is once you then have that sort of general foundation, it's easier to transition into a private one-on-one lesson when the child might be a little bit more mature, and have a better sort of concentration. But in saying, to talk about concentration, a concentration for a 3.5-year-old to a 5-year-old is never going to be 30 minutes. Even for a 6 or 7-year-old, it's never going to be 30 minutes nonstop. What you're looking for is sort of 2-minute snippets, 2 minutes break, 2 minutes break, 3 minutes break, etc. And it's something that grows over the time. So that's an expectation that parents need to have, if and when their child is learning music. And so
Right.
going on to, transitioning into an instrument, I think one of the catches as to why probably I'm more familiar with the Suzuki method than you being a brass player is that at a young age, really generally speaking, the only options for instruments are, for example, violin, cello, depending on the size of the child, piano, and maybe guitar, because you're at the right size to be learning those instruments. Whereas, as a woodwind or a brass player, you need to be physically developed and have, a good sort of breathing,
Teeth. You need
technique.
to have
Yeah,
teeth to play
there you
trumpet,
go. And teeth
and
too.
you need to have an arm that's long enough to play trombone because they
There you
don't make.
are.
Oh, they do, but that's not going to that.
Yeah, but so there are all these other physical limitations that you, as a young child, would not allow you to move and consider a woodwind or a brass instrument. So you're looking at, around year 3 or year 4, generally
Mm-hmm.
speaking, until it's an appropriate time to consider those instruments. But and that's the catch, I think a lot of parents want their child to be involved in music at an earlier age. And so this is one of the ways that you can do that with a teacher that's experienced. I'm sure, of course, there are other ways to do that, but one of the, I guess, tried and tested ways would be to engage a Suzuki qualified teacher, um, because they have that ongoing professional development, they have that training, and they've got that philosophy and nurturing view of introducing music to the child. And so, depending on the instrument that you're learning, I mean, I can only speak about violin, not so much the other instruments, but really where you would start is, like I said, learning about the oral skills. And then in terms of learning the instruments, they use a lot of different physical objects that aren't necessarily the instrument in itself, um,
Right.
to learn about the posture, because it depends on the age of the instrument. So for example, with the violin, if you've got a really young child that is learning, you might start by using a sponge violin, just so that they've got,
Really?
like, yeah. So you might put a sponge on the child's on the shoulder, just to learn how to hold the instrument so that they're not damaging the instrument. But like I said,
Oh, that's very cool.
it depends on the child, and
Mm.
and it's really what you start the child to learn will be different based on the age. So, learning different rhythms and strokes, and learning on particular strings.
Yeah. Wow. That's very cool indeed. Um, Yeah, I really like this idea that you just substituted a real instrument with a sponge like replica, as so that's just because a violin can be quite intimidating to a child. There's four strings, it's wooden, it smells funny, and like oh, it feels uncomfortable. So this idea of just here's a replacement just physically put it there, just to get the act of putting your hand there is quite interesting. Um, Yes, I've briefly forgotten what I was going to ask now.
No, that's all right. But yeah, look, I think one of the main things that I'd really want to get across is that I think the Suzuki teaching philosophy is really about how can you develop a person as a whole. How can you develop someone to have respect for others, respect for the community? How can you develop discipline? It's not just about the music lesson and learning an instrument. It's more than that. Um,
It's beyond that.
yeah, and that there's a huge emphasis um, on really finding ways to make it work. If you read Dr. Suzuki's book, Nurtured by Love, you get a really good insight into what he's really trying to achieve, and that's access, to music, for everyone, and that's very much through repetition, you know so repeating how, so that you can develop your motor skills. It's about actually picking up the instrument, playing the same phrase or the same rhythm over and over again until you get it. In saying that, obviously you can't just repeat the same thing wrong 20 times. It's about playing it once through. If you've identified that, something's not quite right, fix it up and then play it again, and then repeat the right thing over and over again so that you're developing your muscle memory. So I think, yeah, generally speaking, that would be one of the main thoughts that I have about why, the Suzuki Method for young children is really just a fantastic place to learn.
Yeah. I just remember what I was going to say. Um, what you touched on before, really briefly, was that Suzuki teaches. There's this kind of consistency to how they to their teaching approach, and the fact they're all qualified. And it's really attractive for parents to really just say, okay, I'm going to go to Suzuki Teacher. It's kind of a known quantity. Whereas with Wind and Brass, it's kind of almost a luck of the draw, depending on your school and who they've hired and how they've been taught. So when I grew up, I was very fortunate. My teacher was fantastic. He was a very good jazz musician, and then entered Con High, and obviously I had tertiary level tuition throughout all of high school, so I had the very best. But I can see for a lot of people at normal schools, that's not quite there, and so a lot of parents are like, well, a Suzuki teacher could be a good opportunity. And so that's why it's really fascinating for me. I actually haven't really been introduced to the notion of like philosophy. So like Orff and Kadai, I was really introduced to them for the first time in university, as well as Suzuki. And so I thought to myself, gee whiz, if only I had that kind of exposure when I was, in my developmental phases. I wonder where I'd be today. So that's very cool. I think we could move on to the next thing I'd like to talk about with you. So we've explored Suzuki Method quite a bit, but running a music center. So you're running the whole thing. Could you explain to us how you got to this position of running that center and the things involved, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So, in short, I sort of stumbled upon it unexpectedly, um, and funnily enough, look, I because initially I had some arrangements made in place for me to continue legal work. But then this opportunity came up. Turns out, it's where I started, my music journey. And in short, I think we now have 200 students at the centre. We're at a new
Wow.
premises, and we receive some support from the Lane Cove Council for the space, but we very much run in and of itself. So it funds itself. And we have 20 teachers, and so a number of students for each of those teachers. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of scheduling, administrative work, planning that goes into running a centre,
Hmm.
and sometimes it's very easy to sort of not realise how much work is involved. But I think, yeah, for me, being the general manager, I run the day-to-day operations. So in short, my responsibility is to ensure that everything runs smoothly. So, the scheduling, all the students are scheduled at the right times, talking to parents, talking to new clients potentially, and sharing information with them, and just managing all the general sort of back end work as well. So looking, the bookkeeping, the data entries, etc., maintaining relationship with the council. Yeah. But in short, I think to sum it up, I just look after the day-to-day operations, make sure that it's functioning, and assist parents and teachers, and provide them with the support as much as I can. But they very much sort of come in and do what they need to do, and run their own practice in one of our 6 soundproof studios. And they've got
Wow.
access to grand pianos and upright pianos. So that's obviously something that's taken some time, 25 years of really being able to have that equipment.
Yeah, you don't just buy 6 pianos on a whim.
No, no, definitely not. And they're all, they're good quality, and it's a really nice setup for the parents because they've got a nice common room area where they can just relax before their lesson. Sometimes they might set up their instrument there and just get settled in rather than rushing in to the room. So it's got a really nice atmosphere. It's very positive, very nurturing, and very encouraging, and it's very culturally diverse. as well. So I think a lot of people really like that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's very cool. I think I also have a dream of eventually expanding the Modest Orchestra to having its own music center, much that operates very similar, actually, basically the exact same way that you operate yours. So it's very comforting to know that you can run it at our age. Um, so my question to you is: obviously, we're going through unprecedented times at the moment with COVID-19. So how has you have you transitioned to online learning? Um, if you have, how does that logistically work? So at our school, we have a lot of practice room studios. So each teacher kind of just goes into their practice room, they plonk their laptop, they're next to the piano, and they teach away. Is that how you guys have been doing it? Has it been a home situation?
Yeah, so we very much give the option to the tutors. So, first of all, yes, we have, of course, moved across to online teaching platforms. And so teachers are using just different video conferencing methods, it could be Zoom, etc. And they could either run those lessons, from their own home music studio, or alternatively, they can continue to use our studios to run their online lessons. So students aren't able to have face-to-face lessons, but they can still use our premises to run everything sort of as per normal. Of course, it's taken a bit of adjustment, but I think we've had really good response and a lot of great support from parents, to see some of the benefits of the online lessons. It has been a bit of difficult for younger students, but I think what parents seem to like about the online lessons is that they're actually finding that they're getting more time out of the lesson, because the student can do all the setup of their instrument before the lesson, and they can place their books on the stand so they're all ready to go. They're also learning new skills, and being more independent because they're having to learn how to tune their instrument if that's not something that they were doing already. So
Mhm.
that's a really good learning curve for the students to learning how to take more initiative in planning all of that prior to their lesson. And on top of that is because they're at home at the moment, after the lesson finishes, it's as simple as just turning off, their Zoom lesson. They actually then have the motivation to just continue their practice routine and actually revise the material that they're learning straight away. So they've got a much better memory retention. Really, they're much more enthusiastic, and
Mm.
they've got a bit more of an encouragement to practice rather than stopping the lesson and then just switching over to something else. They've actually got that time to digest everything that's been hit at them in that 30 minutes. So there has been some really good and positive support and outcomes that are coming from the online lessons. And I think one of the other things that has been really good is that it's really teaching the child to be more independent in terms of taking instruction better. Because sometimes, obviously, particularly with younger children, the when the teacher's communicating with the child in a face-to-face lesson, they might be using more tactile movements, and physically, helping the child place their fingers, X, Y, and Z, and etc. But now the child actually needs to really think for themselves and really be a bit more independent and really actively think, rather than just being, led all the time. So I think that is really helping the children develop and mature in a really positive way.
Yes, I agree so much. So what I've noticed, because I teach year 3 all the way to year 10, is that the younger groups have actually pleasantly surprised me, especially my year 3s and year 4s. They have really owned they've taken real ownership of this. I have to learn. I have to really put my efforts into this, and you can kind of see that the cogs in their brain ticking away as you say something, and then it's almost as if they're learning. I don't want to say better, but the type of learning they're doing is completely different to the one that we have traditionally face to face. So I think there's a slight, if there is a silver lining, this is the slight one. What I have noticed though is around year 7 and 8, is where that ownership tends to drop, um, which is really interesting. Year 9 and year 10 is when it comes back. So it's almost like that. as they enter high school, as they enter puberty, there's that kind of just drop in this ownership. So that's what I've observed so far. But yes, I agree. Especially in the younger years, they have to all of a sudden develop this skill of teaching themselves and being more critical, um, which in turn really helps them with their self practice at home because, you're only as good as how well you can be critical of yourself. You can see a teacher once a week, maybe 3 times a week if you're really lucky and you can afford it. But ultimately, it's how critical you are in the practice room. So these students are developing that, which is very cool.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, one of the misconceptions sometimes, a bit off track, but, with, private lessons is that I think sometimes parents aren't aware that there's lots of different aspects of learning music, developing oral skills, general knowledge, theory, musicianship. And on top of that, technique for their instrument. And sometimes it's really difficult to learn all of those things in a 30-minute lesson, particularly if that's
Hmm.
something that you're having once a week. And so you said it yourself, if you've got access to have, more than one lesson, or lessons that, are specifically targeted towards different things, that is so beneficial in the same way that you have that you take that approach when you're learning, for example, English. You don't just have an English lesson. You might have creative writing, comprehension, grammar, punctuation, different lessons targeted towards different aspects of how you learn the language better. And that, I think that needs to be, we need to shed some light on that you need to do that in music. You need to actually be targeting each of those skills. Of course, you can
Hmm.
do that in an instrumental lesson, but I think to expect that in a 30-minute lesson, over a short period of time can be challenging.
Yes. Um, so, like, I guess even teaching students the concept of there are 4 ways to practice music. My teacher Leanne Sullivan was this was a method for brass players because we can only basically practice the exact same amount of time as singers. Actually, funnily enough, because that's right, you used to be a singer. And interesting thing I've noticed is that we can't, we chop out eventually. So that means our lips basically give way. So there's a few ways to practice. 4. One is with music with your instrument. Second is with music without your instrument. One is without music with your instrument, so memorization. And then the final one is without music and no instrument. So really just this multi experiential way, I suppose, of just approaching music and say, I've got to learn it these separate ways. Because if you just rely on, at least with trumpet, just playing with your music, with your instrument, well, then you're not going to get much practice done. You're not going to be able to work on all these other things. Um, and so I kind of like that little square. She drew a diagram, just a little box square with squares on the inside. And it was very cool. It just made me realize, oh, hey, I've actually got to practice other things of music. And by doing those 4 things was a kind of conveniently packaged way of exploring those things, like you said, um, which is very cool.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable because it goes to show that also there are different ways to practice. You don't always physically have to get your instrument out to have valuable and efficient practice. You can absolutely practice without your physical instrument, but just using, for example, the sheet music and following that along, listening to, recordings of the piece so that you know what it should sound like. Just doing essentially pretending that you've got your instrument there and learning the fingerings, which would be the case, for example, in violin. You don't have to use the bow. Just developing your motor skills there and knowing where should your fingers be placed. So there's lots of different ways to break it down, so that you feel like you're getting more practice time, without having to sort of sit and do the same type of practice for endless lengths of time. Because obviously, like you said, in your case, for woodwind and brass, and even for vocalists, it's very difficult to do that. Arguably for string instruments, or piano, you can arguably sit for longer, and practice. But the thing is, there's no point in practicing for endless lengths if it's not efficient practice. You want to be smart
Mm-hmm.
about your practice so that you're actually improving. Length of time doesn't improve if you're just practicing the wrong thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Which is what you touched on earlier in Suzuki, which is the right kind of practice with your parent. And I like it how Suzuki has basically taken my teachers, here's the four squares, and it's just kind of put into this philosophy, which is we're learning about music, we're learning through memorization, but we're also going to learn how to read when, cognitively you're able to interpret abstract symbols, like what is a dot with a line on it, that what does that mean to a kid? I don't know. So there's obviously, you have to wait for them to be able to, like, the visual perception to catch up with the oral perception. So I like how you progress as a person, and then the music kind of catches up with you, which is very cool indeed.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to touch on there. So I think you've put that, you've nailed that on the head in terms of d- just pulling to distinctions, between sort of how it can all come together. But one thing is with the teachers, I know you were talking about before, finding the right teacher. I think one thing that needs to be emphasized is that, regardless of your qualifications, everyone's going to teach with their own teaching sort of philosophy and method in mind, regardless of what their credentials are. So, in
Right.
saying that, you're a Suzuki qualified teacher, or, you've got Kodai experience, et cetera, is that all of those teachers will use that information that they've been taught and they'll translate that in a way that works for them. So,
Mm,
sometimes finding the right teacher can be really challenging because it's not just about looking at the teacher that has the right credentials. You've really got to find
mm,
the right teacher that works for you. And that ultimately just comes down to sometimes recommendations, and giving the teacher a go, and having a conversation with them to better understand what their goals are, and knowing whether you're going to be a good fit for them. So it's not as easy as just sort of putting a blanket statement and going, oh, because you've got X qualification, you've got a teaching qualification, whatever the teaching qualification is, that means you're qualified to teach, but every qualified teacher still teaches in a different way.
yes. Yes. I think when I said that before, I think I just tried to simplify it overly, and then that came across. But thank you for clarifying that. That is so true. Just because you've got a qualification doesn't mean that you suit that teacher suits you. People have their own characters. They have their own ways of explaining things. So it very much is a journey of finding the right teacher. Um, and I'm fortunate to have had two very good teachers, um, Leanne Sullivan and Gerasimos Ioannidis, who's my Greek trumpet teacher. Both completely different, but both kind of are like my yin and yang in terms of trumpeting, and both have like um, developed it where, like, Leanne has really made my musician skill go through the roof. Gerasimos kind of just made the whole embouchure setup and the whole technical side of playing trumpet go through the roof. And they both had their own analogies on how to explain things. So yes.
Yeah, no, I can
Um,
agree with that.
yeah. Yeah. Um, I think we can start going to closing statements. I think we've basically covered everything we'd want to. Is there anything you'd like to add at the end before we wrap up this podcast?
Look, nothing springs to mind just at this stage. So I think I'll pass on that.
Okay. So, well, thank you, Cardi, for being on this episode. I learned a lot about, throughout this third attempt of this podcast. The first time, just not really knowing what Suzuki was. I've just heard about it and just know that, it's a methodology to learn. But this experience has really taught me a lot about it. So I hope that this listeners kind of get an idea of what Suzuki is, especially the wind and brass players. Um, and just that it's a very cool system. I've been saying cool quite a bit, but it is cool. Um, Approach to learning music that isn't just specific to the instrument. It's kind of growing you as a musician and as a person through the violin as a conduit almost. It's like, here's an instrument. This will develop you as a person.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. You've understood what I've tried to be say, what I've tried to say.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Look,
Oh,
look, that's a very shortened version of it. And look, there's so much more that you could talk about. But I think, just to give you sort of a foundational understanding, that would be sort of the crux of it from what I know. And so, if anyone would love to share more about that, it's definitely a great conversation to have.
great. All right, Cardi, thank you for being on the podcast. And I'm sure we'll have you back on sometime soon.
Great. Thank you so much, Penny.
All right, bye.
Thanks. Bye.
And then there we go. Stop recording.